this is a little weird, I have to say it. I don't tend to think of myself as somebody who keynotes renowned technical conferences like this, so I'm still kind of adjusting and getting used to everything, so stick with me. It's just a weird thing. They said, Alex and all the other wonderful organizers are like, we want you to come in and talk about this stuff that you do. And I was like, hey, sure, I can do that. And it's like, oh, now I need to figure out what it is that I do exactly, because I don't know if I didn't conceptualize it like I set out to do these things and that's what I'm known for. It's just kind of stuff that I do, and so people want me to talk about it, which is awesome. But I have to kind of think about what is it that I do and how do I want to communicate what I do and all that. And I could just take the simple route and just be like, well, I do these things. I'm a kind of a designer, developy type person. I do a lot of work in diversity arena, about diversity and technology, things like that. And I could just come up and say, hey, I've done these things. These are sort of the things that I've done. But I thought that really wasn't all that exciting. Like, I wanted to talk a little bit more about like why I'm doing things, and especially when it comes to diversity, right? Because this is a question that comes up a lot. In this field, it's come up often, maybe almost every day at this point. So if I'm going to come talk about this question of what am I doing in diversity, what am I doing in this field, what am I doing in education, I think it's not enough just to answer these simple questions of doing this or that. It's more of starting this discussion and creating this context for having the discussion in the first place. Why are we doing this? How does it fit into our field as a whole? How can we improve all of that? So I'm going to tackle that, and we'll see how it goes. So I know that you guys have been all day here. You've been listening to some amazingly smart people. All of them talking about how we can take our knowledge and understanding of programming and push it ahead. And so now I kind of want to talk about what that all means. But where I'm coming from, to answer the simple questions first, I'm Jen. I work by day at a place called Dev Boot Camp, which in Chicago. There's one in San Francisco as well. We're a accelerated Ruby on Rails training program. So we have beginners come in, and then we turn them into world-class beginners. So they have a little bit more knowledge, and they can go out the door and know how to learn. That's essentially the goal. You can't make anybody a master software developer in 9 weeks, and we're not really interested in it. But we're interested in taking people and teaching them how to learn. And get comfortable with that process of learning and growing, and send them out in the world to do that. The other thing that I do a lot of is I'm involved with an organization called Girl Develop It. I actually, in 2011, I founded the Columbus, Ohio chapter of that. And if you're not familiar with Girl Develop It, now it's a national, international organization, I think, of chapters in different cities, and they provide introductory programming classes aimed at women. It's more of a grassroots thing. It's just been kind of emerging there. So I've been kind of shifted into most of the work that I'm doing is in this education realm, in this diversity realm, kind of this meta realm of thinking about how are we, communicating and teaching programming, and how are we communicating with the public about what this is, this software that we're making, what does it even mean? So that's, there's a high level of what I do, and on the lower level, it's also, I don't know if I consider myself an expert in any of that stuff. I don't know if I consider myself an expert in anything. If I'm good at anything, it's like it is being a beginner. So I've been around the tech industry for about a decade, I think. It's hard to keep track. I've done a little bit of everything. I've studied computer science. I worked in technical support. Like I said before, most of my career has been spent as a web designer. And then now I'm doing educational things. So I've kind of have this mixed bag of experiences, and I feel like the only thing I'm really good at is learning and beginning and jumping into things. But I actually am kind of into that. But I also say that to make clear that I'm not giving this talk or any of the things I'm going to talk about today. It's not so much that I'm a seasoned general and I'm debriefing you on all these winning strategies. I don't necessarily have those. I feel much more like I'm writing you a letter from the trenches, and this is just what I'm seeing. And I don't really have answers. I don't even know exactly how I feel about a lot of this stuff. And honestly, right now, I feel pretty uncertain. I feel a little scared. So the best I can do is say, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I know for me, and I'm going to try to put that in some sort of a context in the way it makes sense to me, and hopefully that will connect with you, and it will give us this context to have a larger dialogue. So, as I said before, most of my career has been spent in design. I'm really, really fascinated by the concept of interfaces in general, both in a very specific like software context and just in general what an interface is, what it means. I love the idea of intersections, of these places where there's potential for action. And in software specifically, we have lots of interfaces, and that's where users come in to actually use the things that we make. And there's lots of really fascinating stuff around that, which is why I've been drawn to making those things. I really like the idea of being able to understand enough about both sides, the software side, the user side, and creating a bridge so that people can use it most effectively. And thinking about interfaces and why I like interfaces and all of that stuff, I started thinking about what that process is like. So I had an experience once a few years ago in a work project I was working on, and we had this just massive system that we were working with. I think it was academic-based, something along those lines. And a client had come to us, and they're like, "You need to do something with this because we don't know." And our team was working on, building a new system for them, and it was really difficult to deal with all of this old code that was there, figuring out what they wanted, terminologies, all these different things. This is an actual rendition of what spaghetti code looks like. And that's kind of system we were in, and it was really difficult to figure out what my job was with this. I just felt like there's this huge, overwhelming system that we have to deal with. It was just handed to us, and we're supposed to make it better, but it's hard to even know where to start or what to start doing. I don't even know, how do I even understand what this is? And I actually did, when I was working on this, the tasks I was supposed to do, I felt really overwhelmed. I felt really, I don't even know how to understand this. I can't get information from the clients to understand what they need to use it for. I try to look under the hood and look at the code and try to figure out what's doing what and what's connecting to what, and I'm just completely confused and overwhelmed. And then at some point, all of a sudden, I just realized, I don't have to rebuild everything or redesign everything all at once. As a team, we weren't rebuilding it all at once. I could take a little piece that I had access to that did make sense to me, and maybe I can create a new way for the users to interface with that, to work with that. And I did that. And when I did that, I realized that we had clarified some goals and some functionalities, that we had clarified something at least. And from there, then we could start a longer discussion with the clients. I could have a more productive discussion with the developers I was working with. And then we could start that kind of build on top of that. So I realized that I don't have to do all this all at once. If I'm faced with this system that I don't quite understand or I want to improve but I don't know what to do with, I can just pick a piece and create a new way for people to interact with it. And we can build off that from there, and hopefully we can build a whole new, better system from that. And so I learned that, and I also learned that there are lots of systems, and there are lots of interfaces. And there are a lot of systems that are misunderstood, and a lot of interfaces that are not optimized. When I was navigating a lot of the cultural waters in the technology field that were challenging to me, I realized I was very much of the same type of place, where we have this huge sprawling system. There's lots of history there. There's lots of things that work well now. But there is difficulty for some people to connect with all of that. There's difficulty in explaining that. We look at this and we see certain things like there's a gender imbalance, there's a racial imbalance, there's a class imbalance. There's even just in general the sense of the public doesn't really understand what we do when we make software, right? It's a very mysterious black box thing. So there's a lot of things around there that aren't quite connecting, or it reminded me of this code base that I used to work in that was just so overwhelming that I didn't know what to do with it. But if I could take a piece of this culture that I have access to, that I have control over, and create a different way for people to interact with it, maybe we can start something and make everything a little bit better. So I started applying that type of thinking to what I wanted to see in a society level, or within this industry level with people, and what we were doing with education and minority groups and all of that type of thing. I tried to approach it in this idea of creating a new type of an interface. So like the first thing when we're creating the interface, though, when I was I'm actually working in a technical sense, one of the first things I do is we have to understand what we're dealing with in the first place. So I have a few things that I'm going to throw out here that describes what we're going for, and these are just a grab bag of stuff, so let's just go through them. This is the first one. The funny thing is, I said earlier that this question pops up a lot. It pops up so often that I actually was able to replace this article, because it just came out last week, or a week before. It's September 12th. And I actually had a different one in here, and then all of a sudden this popped up. I'm like, oh, I can use that. That's how often this information and things come up here. This is a story in the Atlantic, a little bit of a attention-grabbing title that we don't need to spend too much time on. But the basic point of this is there's a new report that came out from the US Census, again, just this month in September 2003, describing the trends in STEM fields and education for women and other minorities. And basically, the biggest point out of this, which you see in the subheadline there, is that women's participation in STEM and the computing fields specifically have been declining since 1990, and also includes that the growth of young women coming into computing fields is not growing very much. So this is what actually comes out of the census report. I will, when I post slides, I have links to all the different studies and things I'm referencing. Also, if you're really, really interested in educating about the current landscape, all of those articles that I'm referencing, they also have this wonderful thing called comment sections. And they are fantastic mines of information about discovering what the current landscape is, or if you just really want to hate yourself. Either one, you can go check out every article that I'm posting here has hundreds of comments, so you can just imagine how much fun that is. But this is the whole idea. Let's gather data, let's get a sense of what this landscape is like. In the census report that just came out this month, these were listed literally, I took these verbatim from the highlights of the report. And just really quickly to read off some of those are, so basically, women's representation in computer occupations has declined since 1990s. Nearly 1 in female science and engineering graduates are out of the workforce. The most recent decades show that the growth in STEM employment for young women is slowing. And just to throw this up too, that blacks and Hispanics are still very underrepresented in STEM. That hasn't changed. That's just there, and I think it's kind of important to put that up there. Most of the stuff that I'm going to talk about in this section of kind of gathering data and understanding our landscape is based on gender. We don't even really have resources for a lot of the other areas that aren't based on gender, which is kind of a commentary all in itself. But it's important to kind of make a note of that. So this is another thing that came out fairly recently. I think this is in the last year. As I said, I'm just going to throw out some studies that we have and see if we can draw some parallels at the end. So we'll go through a few of them. This is test scores for science tests that were given to grade school girls and boys in countries all over the world. It turns out in 65 countries other than the US, girls actually outperform boys. In the US, it was dramatically the opposite. This is interesting, just to say that looks like there's some cultural imbalances. And depending on where you are and what kind of society you're in, we get different results in terms of expressing aptitude. This is another study that was done, and I really like the title of this. Apparently psychologists have senses of humor too. They did a study where they gave a math test to, I think it was all college-age men and women, told a certain portion of the women that they could use a fictitious name. Just basically they're separating themselves from the idea of who they are as themselves, and then measured the performance on it. And every woman who used a fictitious name performed better on this math test. Even if she used a name of like another woman, it wasn't even this specifically gender thing. It was this idea if she could release herself from the expectations of whatever she thought she had to reach up to or live up to, she actually performed better. Men had no difference whatsoever. So it seems like there's some strange ideas of women have in their heads of what they need to live up to, and if that impacts their ability to do certain things, especially in math fields. There's a very similar study that was done fairly recently, and this was for college students in physics classes. And instead of separating from the idea of themselves, they actually kind of did the opposite, and they asked people to reaffirm themselves. And they had a portion of the exam that was to describe their values. And it was going to be like a graded portion, so it had equal weight. And then the rest of this was some standard physics stuff. And what happened is that the women who were given a space to talk about their values and essentially reaffirm themselves closed the gap in between men and women on their performance on the physics side. Whereas in the control group, when that didn't happen, the women were far below the men in terms of that. And again, with the men, no matter what they did, it was pretty much across the board. This is another study that came out. These will end soon, don't worry. I'm just making a point. This is specifically a psychological study about and I think this was a lot of tech job descriptions. They took a study of all these different descriptions, found different words and adjectives that were used for jobs that were typically geared towards women, such as secretarial jobs, things of that nature, and then got jobs that were geared towards men. And it's nothing even like it's nothing obvious. It's not like they called everybody programmers, and that's why the women didn't want to apply, although that does happen, right? This was much more subtle. This is just words that we don't even think about as typically masculine or feminine, but kind of unconsciously as a society we've learned to associate with one gender or the other, and those will pop up in job descriptions. And the study actually says that they think this will continue that workplace imbalance and things like this. This is one of my most favorite pieces of research that I turned up in this. A researcher did a study of many transgender men in the workplace. This is not specifically tech, but just in the working world in general, and recorded their experiences and how many transgender men, what their experiences were like working as a woman there and then coming back to the same place and working as a man. And it is fascinating. There's this anecdote right there, if you see in there, where there's literally a man named Thomas. And he transitioned on the workplace and came back as Susan. And somebody else in an associate company actually told the supervisor, it's like, hey, getting rid of Susan, that was a good move. This Thomas guy was really great. And what's even more interesting in this study, though, is that there were companies that were aware of their transition. And they were still treated differently, because even when they were aware of it, there was so much kind of cultural bias and differences in how you would treat one gender or another, that even when they were perfectly aware this is literally the same individual, when they presented differently, they were treated differently. So that's just a sampling of all this other stuff. So I'm going to tie it together with a quote I really love by a woman named Sally Ride. And when she was asked about these imbalances that we see specifically in the science field or the space program where she was involved, somebody asked her that specifically, is it that women just aren't interested? Is there a biological difference? What's going on? And this was her response. She said, suppose you came across a woman lying on the street with an elephant on her chest. You notice she's short of breath. Shortness of breath can be a symptom of heart problems. In her case, the much more likely cause is the elephant on her chest. For a long time, society put obstacles in the way of women who wanted to enter the sciences. That is the elephant. Until the playing field has been leveled and lingering stereotypes are gone, you can't even ask the question. So I think she really does sum up what I think about all of this, is that I think that we have a lot of data that points to some clear psychological stereotypes that have grown through our culture and that come out in our behavior that a lot of times we're not even aware of. And if we want to talk about any kind of, why aren't more women doing this? Are they not interested? What do we need to do to fix this? We really need to look at all these kind of almost, and a lot of times, unconscious barriers that are there, instead of attributing to other things that are far less likely. We'll get to those down the road, but first let's take care of the things that we have data on that we are seeing right in front of us and see what we can do with that. So it took me a really long time to start thinking about all this stuff. 10 or so years ago, maybe a little bit longer, I had started teaching myself HTML, and I thought it was really cool to put stuff in the computer and make it do things. And I never had experience like that, because I grew up in rural working class Ohio, and I was very artsy, so I didn't have access to a computer, and I wasn't really thinking that I could do anything like that. So when I finally found that stuff, it was really cool. And so I immediately decided I was going to go learn computer science, because it was that simple, right? And so I went to a computer science program in a small school in Ohio, and it kind of sucked. It was not a good experience. It was really demoralizing. I was the only female computer science major in my entire school, my entire class. There was one more in the school. She was a year beyond me, and that was it. Most of my classes were me and a bunch of dudes who didn't want to talk to me. They were very nice. They just didn't want to talk to me. And it was just really difficult for somebody who was coming from an outside perspective. I'm a very visual person too, so this stuff is definitely not things that comes to me naturally. I'm very interested in it, but I have to really think about it and work at it and approach it from different directions. It was really hard for me in that environment. And I made it through. I kept going through, and we're over 3 years down the road, and I was getting by, but I was just getting really frustrated. I felt super isolated. And in that experience right there, I went to, I spent a summer working as a tech counselor in a kids' tech camp. It was super fun. It was hosted at Carnegie Mellon, which is a really great computer science school. And so I also got access to some of the other counselors who went to Carnegie Mellon. And there was a woman in particular who taught the older kids some programming, C++. And she was a computer science major at Carnegie Mellon. And I found someplace, I was sitting down, and I was telling her my experiences. And at the time I was talking to her, I had pretty much come to the conclusion that I just could not do this. That was the only logical conclusion, that I just wasn't smart enough, my mind just didn't work that way, and that even though I was kind of making through these classes and I was still really interested in being able to make things, that I just wasn't good enough to do it. And that was basically the conclusion I had come to. And it was really interesting because I was telling her all these things, and I was telling her that I just feel like everybody else already knows this stuff, and I feel like I can't ask questions, and because then they'll think, oh, well, she doesn't know that, she doesn't belong here, all of this type of stuff. And I'll never forget, she said to me, she says, I feel exactly the same way. And it totally blew my mind because she had all the other advantages that I didn't have. She was naturally really good at programming. One of her parents was a math professor. She was at Carnegie Mellon in the computer science program there. It's like, you obviously know what you're doing. So why do you feel the same way I do? Because the reason I feel the way I do is because I don't know what I'm doing. And she said that, and all of a sudden it made me question, maybe there's something else out there that I'm not aware of. Maybe that, does anybody else feel this way? And she suggested this book to me. It's called Unlocking the Clubhouse. And a couple of psychologists at Carnegie Mellon, just coincidence, decided to study all of this stuff. And they published this book about 12, 13 years ago. She suggested I read this. I read this, and again, it was another mind-blowing experience where there's not only all this data, but all this anecdotes. I remember just going through the pages and all of these stories of women saying the exact same thing I was thinking and feeling. And they were women who had different backgrounds, just like me and this other woman that I had compared myself to. And like, but you're perfect. You have all these things. I don't, and that's what the problem is. No, that wouldn't be the case. There was a variety of women who had a variety of different backgrounds and experience and aptitude levels, and the only common thing that they had was that they were women, and they were having the same experiences. And that made me think that, okay, maybe there's something else going on here. At the time, though, I couldn't do anything about it because I ended up having my daughter, and then I was a little busy for a few years. And I was doing web design and IT work, but I wasn't really focused on learning new things for a number of years. I was a single mom, too, so like when I say a little busy, I mean like I was crazy, horribly busy for years. And then I got to a point, maybe, 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, where I realized I had been out of things for a while. And I realized that I had to make a choice, whether I have to entirely give up on tech and go to something that I'm just good at, or I'm going to rededicate myself to learning this. And I'm really going to attack it, and I'm just going to do it. And I decided the latter. But I also decided that I didn't want to have the same educational experience I had the first time around, and that there was nothing else around that seemed to be better than that was easily accessible to me. So I just decided that I was going to have to make something like that. In my little journey here, is essentially when I decided that I'm going to have to make a new way for me to interface with this industry if I'm going to get the things out of it that I need. And that's essentially what I did. So I started Girl Develop at Columbus. At the time when I started this, Girl Develop It existed for maybe about 6 months. It was started by 2 women in New York in late 2010, I believe. And I had started thinking about something like this, an idea of a program that would offer classes in an environment that would be really welcoming to people who felt like they didn't belong in other classes that were available. At the time, I was just going to do my own thing. I heard they were doing their thing. I reached out to them. I'm like, can I get some advice? And they're like, sure. It's like, you want to just do this? And I'm like, hey, why not? Let's do that. So I just said, hey, we're going to do this thing. In Columbus, Ohio, where I lived at the time, I got some support from the community, saw who was interested in teaching classes. A local company gave us some space, and we just started doing classes. Eventually, I started doing the HTML classes for us, and it just kind of snowballed. Like I said, when I started the Girl Develop It chapter in Columbus, I guess somebody had done something in Sydney, but at the time there was really only 2 official chapters in the US. There are 17 chapters across the world now, and we have a waiting list of other chapters that are trying to get in, and we're actually trying to get our organization stuff together to get them through the door. One of them is St. Louis, actually. So that's why we did an event, or they put together an event. Hopefully it can help them get an actual chapter here started. But the interesting experience of going through Girl Develop It, I've learned a lot, and one of the biggest things I learned, has absolutely nothing to do, or the numbers of women currently in the industry have absolutely nothing to do with lack of interest. They are very, very interested. When you reach out to them, they're like, yeah, we want to do this. We want to do more of this. We want to do as much of this as we can possibly can. And that's a very exciting thing to see. The other thing that I really felt that when we were doing these classes, it didn't have as much to do with gender specifically as it did with just a welcoming environment. And some of the things that I was just talking about that I felt turned me off, that was exactly why I wanted to make sure, I wanted to fix those things in this. So we're going to have a class, and it is going to be totally okay to ask dumb questions. We encourage you to ask dumb questions. And we're going to support each other. We're not going to wonder, like, you mean you don't know that already? Why don't you know that already? No, we're not doing any of that. We're going to support each other to grow and learn, and that's going to be a positive thing. It's going to be a really positive thing that we have the courage to say, hey, I want to learn something new, and I'm going to put myself out of my comfort zone to learn something new. But if I can do that in a supportive environment, it makes it that much easier. And it makes it that much easier to continue to put myself out of my comfort zone and learn if I've had a good start. And so that's what we really emphasize with the classes. And we got a lot of really great feedback for that. So I don't have data quite yet, like I did for some of the other things I had earlier. I don't have studies. I don't have a lot of numbers for you yet. We're still trying to work all that stuff out. It's mainly this came from a lot of people who were frustrated with the available system and said we want to do something different. And so we're going to create a new way for people to interact with the system, to learn this material, to learn all these things that we love to do. We're going to find a way for them to get in and do this. So we don't have a whole lot of data. Personally, I've had a lot of really great experiences, really great feedback. One of the last students in the classes I taught in Columbus, I guess I didn't mention, I now live in Chicago, and so I am co-leading the Girl Develop Chicago chapter. We haven't got any classes started or actually held them yet in Chicago. I'm working on that. But in Columbus, one of the last classes I taught, I had a student who came in, and actually we did it's a 4-week course. We finished the first week, and at the end of the class, she said, I was really scared and anxious to come here, and now I feel really comfortable, and I feel really excited about learning all this stuff. And I was like, that's it. That's what I wanted to do. I don't really have these measurements of, these are the numbers of people who have done this or that, but I have that woman and what she said to me. And that is really, really important to me. So for right now, being able to focus on that one interaction, that really granular level of somebody coming in and having that kind of an interaction, that's super important to me. And that's where my focus is right now. As we continue on with that, hopefully we will, be able to gather more data get more numbers, get some sense of what we've actually done for people. I do have a couple other anecdotes that we have helped people switch careers. I'm very proud personally that another student we had in Columbus is going to be, in a couple weeks, coming to Dev Bootcamp Chicago to launch her career as a software developer, which is really exciting to me. So there's, little bits are happening. It's not this huge, all of a sudden we've changed everything and everything is great. There's just little interactions, little bits happening here and there, and hopefully there's a gaining momentum. So that's a really good thing to think about when we're thinking about this idea of an interface. However, we don't want to just keep it at that level. If we're just doing little things bit by bit, and yeah, that's great, and I really love having those interactions with people. But eventually, we want to make sure that this is what's going into the mainstream system, that these things are in sync. I had a lot harder describing what I want to talk about for this, because we don't have this yet, right? So, and even what we're doing now is we're in this middle stage now where we're creating new interfaces, we're creating little inroads. We don't have a whole big thing here yet. So I was trying to think of some examples of what would exemplify what I would think if we had a new system, if we had people leading a new system that would be pulling people in, be making it this idea of education in software and education for people who aren't in the established tracks for it. Make that a really kind of accessible thing. So I started pulling out some examples of some people who are not doing this necessarily in software, but are doing it in slightly adjacent areas. I have 3 examples, and they all have some of a theme that I swear I didn't plan, so it kind of came out really weird. But hopefully, this will be fun to talk about. One of them, we already had a preview of. This is Sally Ride, and she is one of my absolute heroines ever. If you don't know who Sally Ride is, that makes me really sad, but just in case, Sally Ride was the first American woman in space. She also was this just really amazing person who, after she had her career at NASA, she became an advocate for STEM education and getting more minorities into the space program and just STEM careers and in general. She started a foundation. It's called Sally Ride Science, and she gave interviews. She went to school. She created opportunities and scholarships and all this amazing stuff just to get more people involved in this. This is Sally Ride Science. I meant to go ahead with that. This is a website still up to date. Unfortunately, she died last year of cancer, but up until then, she was very heavily involved. Her partner is still on the board of this foundation to be able to kind of make all that stuff happen. This is another quote from her. It says, "I never went into physics or the astronaut corps to become a role model, but after my first flight, it became clear to me that I was one. And I began to understand the importance of that to people. Young girls need to see role models in whatever careers they may choose, just so they can picture themselves doing those jobs someday. You can't be what you can't see." Well, my favorite thing about her and why, obviously, yeah, she's pretty heroic, and so you would see why people would like her. But for me, the big thing is that she was not a person who struggled with math or science or any of this STEM education stuff that we're talking about. She wasn't like me. She came very naturally to all of this. But she also said at some point that she realized that even though she had just gone through, the other girls her age that she had grown up around, that she had been educated with, were not so lucky. And she said, I don't know why this is. Maybe it was because they were discouraged by an educator, a teacher, a parent at some point along. But at some point, she said all the girls in middle school-ish, they just started not caring about science. They started dropping out of their math classes or not putting effort into that. And they just didn't care about that. And the thing I love about Sally Ride is that she did not look at that problem and say, like, oh, well, they just must not have been good enough for it, or they must not be interested in that. She immediately said, hey, that happened. What can I do to help fix it? She immediately used her power and the ease that came to her and what she had earned through that, and used that and leveraged that to be able to make it easier for other people to learn through her education. And I think that is awesome. And that's one of the reasons that I really, really appreciate her example. This is my other favorite example. This, I had a much more serious picture of him before, and then I found this one, and I'm like, no, this has to go in the slide deck. So if you don't know who this is an astrophysicist named Neil deGrasse Tyson. There's a good chance you do know who he is, which is entirely the point of this. He is very, very visible. He's a very dedicated science advocate. He's been on The Daily Show. He's been on the Colbert Report a number of times. He's all over the media, and he does that deliberately. As a scientist, I think I've even heard in interviews with him before that he said sometimes he'd rather just be in the laboratory. He'd rather just be kind of doing science. But he has a talent for communication, he has a talent for speaking, and he has a talent for reaching people. And he has a passion for science literacy. And so he puts himself out there. If you've never seen him speak, or if you ever have the opportunity to see him speak, even if you have already seen him speak, go do that. He's an amazing speaker. And the main thing about that, though, it's not just that he knows what he's talking about, he does, but it's also this passion that he brings to this idea of science and also understanding science. It's really important to him that the public understands science, not just because he likes it and he wants to push it on everybody else, but because he thinks it's a really powerful tool for our society. This is a quote he gave to NPR at one point. He said, "So I think we're at an interesting paradox. Access to science is greater than ever before, yet you have people who believe they are scientifically literate, but in fact are not. We're in an elective democracy where science and technology will define where the economically strong countries in the world will be. You can't have the people making decisions about the future of the world who are scientifically illiterate." You can replace all of this stuff with just straight up technology and you get the same thing. I think this is true about the field we're in. I think it's really, really important that people have, and we don't all have to have the same levels of understanding. There's definitely degrees, but I think the public as a whole should be much more educated on technology. It's not going anywhere. It's a huge part of everybody's lives. And the more that we can make that information accessible, the more we can build up an educated populace who can make informed decisions about some of this stuff. So if I had to pick an example of somebody that I feel is, we need somebody going out and doing that for the software industry, I want like our Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's going to put himself out there and he's going to make it exciting and interesting for people to learn about these things so they can inform themselves to make decisions in this society we're moving into the future. So I have one more. This is still kind of in the same theme, not quite as much. So this is kind of meta. This is Lieutenant Uhura from Star Trek, the original 1960s Star Trek series. The actress who played her was a woman called Nichelle Nichols. Nichelle Nichols is awesome. If you don't know anything about her, you should go look some information up about her. She's did a lot of really interesting things, and it kind of started, there's a story that she tells often. You may have heard this, especially, I know it's kind of crazy, there might be some Star Trek fans here, but I'm guessing there might be one or two. So she has this story she told, and so this is original Star Trek. It started in 1967, I believe, so 67, 68. She was in the show. She was the only black person, certainly and the only female main character. And this was at that time period. I think she said in interviews that she actually had people who lived in the South in that time who were not allowed to watch the show because the show was integrated. It had the first interracial kiss ever. They got letters about that. It's a crazy time. And at some point, she had been on the show. She enjoyed the show, but she wasn't getting as many opportunities. And another opportunity on Broadway had come up. And so she had decided to leave the show. And it just so happened when she had just made that decision, she spent the weekend at a fundraiser, like a NAACP fundraiser, I think she says it is. And she was there. One of the organizers said, "Hey, there's somebody who really, really wants to meet you." This is one of those stories that you feel like almost can't be real, but if you hear her tell it, you know it is real. This actually happened. So the fan that wanted to meet her was Martin Luther King Jr. And he said, Star Trek is the only show that we let our kids watch because it's great. You're there. And we have this idea of all these people who can work together in this common cause on a basis of science and technology, and they progressed to that point. And so they were talking, and at some point, Nichelle said something on the lines of, I'm really going to miss the people I'm with. And she said, Dr. King's face just immediately was like, "What are you talking about?" And she said, I'm going to leave the show. And he said, "You can't do that. So you can't do that." She says that's literally what, apparently, according to her, he said to her, he said, "You can't do that." He said, "Do you know what it's like to have you on that show, for people to see you? It's that being there tells everybody that it doesn't end here, that there's something else that we can work towards that's farther down the path that's better, and that it's worth everything we're going through now because maybe we can get to something like that." And she stayed on the show. I guess after that experience, you would kind of have to, but she got it. And she did stay on Star Trek. So after she was done with that, she spent 18 years working for NASA as a recruiter. And she went around to universities, she went around to schools, she went around anywhere where there might be people who are interested in math and science and technology, and she recruited. And she brought, basically what she did is she brought NASA this whole pool of diverse people and say, here, choose your astronauts from this pool. And they did. And that's how she was able to pull in the first African-American astronauts. She was able to pull in more women than they had ever had before. And they became part of the pool of qualified people that NASA could choose people for their program from. The first African woman in space, Mae Jemison, cited Uhura as her inspiration for becoming an astronaut. And she actually did a guest spot on Star Trek: The Next Generation because she said that was why she became an astronaut. So I really love the fact that Nichelle Nichols took so much of her life and she took that role seriously. When it was pointed out to her how important that visibility was, to have this vision of what could be, and then to see in the real world that actually did inspire people to do great things. And it actually made actual change in this other industry that she wasn't even a part of. She was an actress. This isn't real, sorry to break it to you, but Star Trek wasn't real. But her influence, well, that's debatable. But her influence and her visibility, it literally created historical astronauts, people who made history because they had that example to look from. I think that's extremely powerful and really, really awesome. The thing is, though, sorry, we don't want that quite yet. So let's keep talking about this. These all examples, they have to do with science and technology and some of the things I'm talking about. They don't have anything to do with what we are doing right here, right? As I do a lot of talking about these topics, and I do interviews, things like that. I remember I did an interview for a TV station in Chicago when we were starting Dev Boot Camp. And they asked me a lot of things about the number of women in the program and all this other things about learning, about what it was like to make applications, to be a programmer. What was that all about? And the last question they asked me was like, what do you think about The Social Network? The movie, right? That was the fictionalized account of Mark Zuckerberg making Facebook, which, if you haven't seen that, is not a positive depiction of a programmer. It's basically the Citizen Kane of programmer movies. But the thing is, that's people's touch points. That's not the first time I've been asked in an interview about The Social Network. It happens a lot. And not only does that happen, I have actually literally had young people, they've all been guys, young people who are interested in being programmers who reference that character in that movie as an ideal that they want to be. And when I try to gently ask about this, it's just kind of like, well, but he's so smart, so it doesn't matter how he acts. So there's this sense of and you know what, but that fits into the programmer stereotype really well, right? I mean, the stereotype exists out there, and it does all of us a disservice because it's a very one-dimensional, kind of an asshole character, essentially, of somebody who is really, really smart in some areas, and that gets him a free pass from growing in other areas. And I find that really, really sad. Human growth is not a zero-sum game. It doesn't mean because you have to stunt your growth in some areas so you can be really awesome in other areas. In fact, it's usually the reverse. So if we could encourage people to, grow as human beings and learn how to embrace the process of growing and embrace the process of learning, it actually might be better programmers too. But we have this, this ideal that exists. We don't have a Uhura. We don't have somebody like that. We have Mark Zuckerberg and The Social Network, who is worse than the real Mark Zuckerberg. I keep saying that name because that's the connotation, obviously, but I'm sure he's a much nicer guy than the guy in the movie. But we know the guy in the movie. That's our touchstone. And that's really disappointing and depressing to me. Like I said, I think that's selling us all short. This is a quote that I really, really love. It's not by a scientist or anybody like that. This is by Ray Bradbury. This is actually a quote taken from a panel that was 1970, right before I can't remember the name of it. One of the satellites we had just sent was going to reach Mars. And the eve of that, they hosted a special panel where they got Arthur C. Clarke, Carl Sagan, and Ray Bradbury together, because there was a time where you could just do that, because it was that awesome at some point. And they talked about all of this stuff, about science and education and what we know and what we don't know. And this was a time where people were really excited about space exploration. And that was, that was driving research, that was driving discovery, that was driving some really amazing things to happen. But it was kind of rooted in the fact that people wanted it. They wanted to see it happen. And this is what Ray Bradbury had to say about a lot of that. So I think it's part of the nature of man to start with romance and build to a reality. There's hardly a scientist or astronaut I've met who wasn't beholden to some romantic before him who led him to doing something in life. I think it's so important to be excited about life. In order to get the facts, we have to be excited to go out and get them. And there's only one way to do that, through romance. We need this thing which makes us sit bolt upright when we are 9 or 10 and say, I want to go out and devour the world, I want to do these things. I think that when we talk a lot about education or diversity or all these things I've been talking about, I think that it's all the same thing in the end. We talk about that in this field that we're in here, and when it comes to making software. I feel like a lot of times we have a resistance to it because we don't want to dilute anything, we don't want to dumb anything down. We want it to be really hardcore and technical, and that's awesome. I respect the impulse. But I think that it's also good to frame it in this context, is that this inspiration, this example that we can have, can get that path started. And that also, that might be able to drive things even further than we would have been able to take them otherwise. There's a lot of stuff going on in this context of we have an interface, we have a system. I'm trying to figure out ways that we can get people to interact with our system that will make the system better. And basically what it comes down to is this idea of, it's not about diluting or dumbing anything down or making things accessible by putting them on a lower level. It's about investing our time and effort to elevate other people. We should be doing that. We should take that as a responsibility on ourselves. That we really love and care about what we're doing. We care about our system. We care about our product. We care about these things that we're learning and that we spend all our time trying to make better. We really care about that. Then instead of saying, well, if you don't really have it at the same level we do, or you don't care about the same level we do, so we're not going to interact with that. Let's run the other direction and be like, let's see if we can bring you up to this level. Let's elevate you. Let's create examples and heroines and heroes and people that we can look up to that inspire and bring that romance and that passion into it. And so we can continue on in that track to bring more people in there. And like I said, I think we can go even farther than we would if we didn't have that in there. It's not necessarily about changing anything that we have now. It's about creating new ways to do it and just building on top of that. And it's also about challenging ourselves. Like I was saying with this example of the programmer that we have, where maybe in some ways they aren't always growing as much as they could be. We all can challenge ourselves to make sure that we're growing and learning as much as we possibly can. Do we have things that we're not questioning? Do we have biases we're not questioning? Do we have things that we've never really thought about before that maybe we don't even realize it, but there are barriers to us growing or learning something new? Let's challenge those. And we can challenge them for the people around us too, or maybe some things that we've always taken for granted that is just the way it is. Maybe that's actually just a big old wall there and we don't even realize it. And there might be something beyond it that would be really amazing and we just don't know because we haven't questioned it. So this whole process of education and reaching out to people who aren't already in the field, to me, is this process of challenging ourselves to be better people so that we can make better things. Because essentially that's what it is at the end for me. And that's my system. That's what I want to do. So I came in saying I'm not really sure how to describe what I do, and I guess I did a little bit too, but it's more important about why I'm doing this. And essentially, that's why I'm doing this. I'm really excited about being a part of this field. I like to create the things that I create. And I'm really excited about learning what I'm learning and being able to learn more about that. It's been a long road for me, but I really, really like it. It excites me. And I like doing it for myself. I like doing it on that granular level. I like doing it on a level where I get to see people who use the things that I make. I get to see like really amazing real-world consequences and accomplishments through software. And that's extremely exciting. Why don't we talk about how exciting that is to other people who don't know about it? Why don't we work to bring other people in so they can be excited with us? Let's clear away the barriers and let's bring in and just share all that. We can have a big party about it. But I think that if we can't do it all right away, right? So we don't want to get overwhelmed and be like, well, we've got to change everything. We don't need to change everything. Some of it's good. Some of it that's not so good, we can create ways to bring more people in and get more help and work together to make it better. And once we've made everything better, then we'll all feel, that we can accomplish more on an individual or a bigger level. So in the end, that's what I'm doing, and I'm going to try to keep doing that as long as I can. And hopefully, at some point we'll have a system in place where we don't even really need to talk about all this stuff anymore. We'll just be out there doing it, and we'll all be out there making great things. And that's what I hope we can get to someday. And that's what I've got, so thank you. I can do questions. Does anybody have questions? Okay. I can't see anything. Okay, maybe I can see you. All right, go for it.
First, thank you.
You're welcome.
My question is, I live in a small town, and there aren't a lot of female developers, and we've put on some classes, and we can't get people to, kind of attend them. And I have been following what's been going on a little bit, with a lot of the chatter about diversity. It's kind of picked up lately. And occasionally there's a resistance to men helping. I think sometimes in some environments that's like that. What would you suggest to those of us that are in a privileged position? I just find myself saying, how can I help? I want to do something about it. And most of the people in the room are solution driven. We see a problem, and so we oversimplify it, and we use logic, which doesn't really work great. So in this context, what would be that thing that you would recommend? Is it just go grab somebody and say, you need to come learn this?
Okay, that's a great question. The question is, so I'm basically, do you mind if I paraphrase a little bit? So I'm a big paraphraser, yeah. So I'm a white dude, I want to help. How do I do that effectively? First of all, that's awesome, and thank you, and I know that there's lots of people like that. My own personal, and it is complicated, especially if you don't have a lot of, you want to do something, but it's hard to get something started. From my own personal experience, I very much have always welcomed men to actually help out with the classes that I'm doing, sometimes because I don't have any other teachers. An interesting thing for me that I didn't really anticipate when I started Girl Develop It is that I was all focused on how we would have to encourage the students, because that's what it's there for, right? I forgot that a lot of times you have to encourage the teachers. I had so many women who would be like, hey, this is awesome, I really want to help, but I don't want to teach, because I can't do that. It's the same problem, and that makes sense in retrospect. So a lot of times I would have men come in to teach, and it would just be a matter of making sure they're really clear of the context and understanding what was important. Like I said before, it wasn't so much about the women thing, it was more about the environment thing and understanding how to be comfortable. It's like you don't have to be a woman to understand that, because it goes beyond that. We just happen to use that as an intersect point. The real diversity is underneath. This is not answering your question, but I'm just kind of setting the context. So what can you actually do? Sometimes you can't do anything. You really do kind of have to make sure that it's the right place and time. And I really like the fact that you just say, like, well, how can I help? And I think that's kind of the best way to go about it, is sometimes there isn't a whole lot you can do, but just kind of be a good person. And honestly, I mean, this goes for everybody. There's a lot of times I've been doing and talking about these issues for a long time. I tend to, sometimes it's tiring, especially with a lot of the other stuff going on. And I got to a point where I realized as well that I can't change everything, I can't do everything. This is where the interface metaphor comes into play, right? Where you may not be able to solve this problem. And you said, I know, it's frustrating. We're problem solvers. We see a problem, we want to go solve it. I'm exactly the same way. It's why I've done a lot of this stuff. Is like, well, that's wrong, so I'm going to fix it. And sometimes I realize, like, you just can't do that. But you could maybe find another way to interface with the problem. So in an example where you had mentioned that you're in a small town, there actually just aren't that many women around or other people around who want to learn this thing, go online. See if you can mentor online. There's lots of people who, and maybe this is something that the system doesn't exist and you might have to create it. I think it's awesome. Like I said, I work at a place where we're producing beginners all the time to go out into the world. And one of the things that we tell them is really, really important is learn the community, learn about open source, contribute to projects, get into that mindset of doing things. So being able to maybe like be a connector for people like that and be like, hey, can I help anybody, make their first pull request? Because I could walk you through that. It's kind of scary, I know, right? You don't know what people are going to say. I can do that. Since I've been doing a lot of speaking, I started offering speaker mentoring on just threw this out on Twitter. I'd be like, hey, do you want to submit a talk, but you don't really know how to think about it or practice or how to write an abstract or anything like that? Just let me know. And I started doing Skype calls with people for half hour and just kind of walk them through all those steps. And it's pretty awesome to see that stuff happening. So maybe you just need to find a way to put out ways that you can help and have people, you basically have to have people come to you and do that. So I would say in general, I really appreciate people who want to be allies and want to help all those things. And I think the best thing to do is to make sure that you're doing a lot of listening and you're a lot of offering that isn't creating extra obligation. And if you want, but I would say also that if you want any advice on doing specific things like that, but don't be afraid to ask those of us who are out there trying to do things, because chances are we need help and we could use all of it that we can get. Does that help?
Very much so.
Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions? I can see some of you now. I see you. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Have you seen any difference in retention for the demographic specific classes like Girl Development versus Dev Bootcamp?
Interesting. They're very different, so I don't know if I feel comfortable comparing to. I'm sorry. The question was retention for programs like Girl Develop as opposed to Dev Bootcamp. For Girl Development, retention is a little bit of a bigger challenge because most people are doing this in the evenings around a job or a family or something like that. And so some of them are just there to learn something new. Not all of them are there to make a huge commitment to try a new career, even though I said we've had a couple of those. That's not always how it goes to be. Something like Dev Bootcamp is a huge commitment. You give up your life. We call it a boot camp for a reason. You give up your life for at least 9 weeks. And the idea of that is, yes, I am making a huge life change. So it's a different thing. We have definitely seen in Dev Bootcamp the numbers of women have been steadily rising as we go along. The cohort that we just started last Monday had more women than any others since we started in April, which is very good. So those numbers are steadily rising. Other than that, it's really hard to make comparisons between the two. I think retention in general in these educational programs, if you create the right atmosphere, we've definitely had women who come back to different Girl Development classes. We've definitely had women who maybe got what they needed out of it but referred other people to it. So we don't see very many women who take a class and then just disappear like, I hate this. Like it turns out I didn't really want that. That doesn't happen. I don't know if I've ever seen that happen, or if it has, it's been so quiet I've never noticed it. Usually we do see women come back. And so far in both the educational programs that I've been working on, we see them at least sticking with it or paying it forward to somebody else or bringing somebody else in, something along those lines. Is that it? That's it. Thank you.